Broadcasting live from Business Radio X studios in Atlanta, Georgia, it's time for Learning Insights, featuring learning professionals improving performance to drive business results.
Welcome to another informative and exciting edition of Learning Insights. This is your host, Stone Payton, and in the studio with me this morning, as is almost always the case, is my good buddy and co-host, Lee Cantor. Good morning, sir.
Good morning, Mr. Stone. How are things going in your world?
I am doing well. I got fantastic news last night. I learned that we now have cash available in the Dave Ramsey envelope cash drawer that we've moved to.
That high finance system of yours.
Yes, cash available for firewood.
Yes.
So Saturday is the day to go pick up firewood and get new tires for the family trip down to South Florida. We're going to do Thanksgiving in Disney, so everything's coming up Stone for me.
That's it. And you consider Orlando, South Florida. That's fun for me.
Actually, once you get to Tallahassee and take a right, you're back in the north, as far as I'm concerned. But yeah, this is going to be a fantastic segment. Please allow me to introduce back to the microphone, no stranger to the Business Radio X studio, Mr. Alvin Miles. How you doing, man?
I'm doing great, Stone. How are you?
I'm doing well, but I miss you.
Man, I it's a good thing to be missed. That's important. But I definitely miss you guys, especially my good buddy Kevin Finn over there behind the microphone. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great. It's always good to talk, and every talk on Learning Insights.
I know, yeah,
they always hide me.
You two are so used to working together, and but you're in kind of a period of transition with moving from Kennesaw State but you're still pursuing your doctorate.
Absolutely.
You got some entrepreneurial stuff. Get us caught up, man.
Yeah, it is a fun thing to have options. You know, my mother always told me, son, make sure that you get enough education to always have enough options so that you're not boxed into any one thing, especially a person that likes variety as much as I do. But yes, I'm one of the few people I know, and I'm sure that there are a lot more people out there that has actually worked and played in 3 sandboxes. Worked and played in the corporate sandbox, worked and played and continue to play in the academic sandbox, and now I'm playing around a little bit in the entrepreneurial sandbox. You know, so those 3 coupled together have really made for variety and the spice of life for me. And so, as you know, Stone, and certainly Lee as well, you know, I spent over 30 years with Bell South, AT&T South Central Bell, a bellhead, and I continue to walk around with a ring on my right finger that signifies that I have actually retired. And then you know that in 2009 I retired and went over to run the executive MBA program at Kennesaw State University, the 3rd largest university in the university system of Georgia and the fastest growing. And, you know, heard some recent news that, we will be actually collaborating, working together, and merging with Southern Poly. So that's coming up as well. There's a bit of transition that happens there as well, and people have got to get settled into that whole notion of what it looks like in the very end. But being that this is Learning Insights, you know, that was important to me to make that transition because learning is important to me. I look in various aspects and try to understand how I can get better. And so that has been fun. And so one of the earlier entrepreneurial pursuits I did while obviously still connected with KSU, it was actually having this program here on Business Radio X, Global Leader Radio. And, of course, folks can still go and be able to pull up some of the
You knew you'd get that plug in there, didn't you?
Got to get a plug in there. I still got to figure out a way to monetize that, too, because, what kind of entrepreneur am I if I can't monetize it? And it's my fault, right?
If only there was maybe some analytics behind it, we could figure out a way to monetize it.
I love it. So, yeah, and so I jumped at the chance when you actually gave me a call and said, hey, why don't you come on over and talk a little bit about Learning Insights. I thought it was pretty interesting. Now, you actually expect me to be able to help people to learn and give them some sort of insight.
Well, you got more degrees than everybody in this room.
Yeah, no kidding. No, actually, we weren't going to hold you personally to that standard, but we thought you might bring someone with you that would have something going. So let's get him folded into the conversation. Introduce your buddy.
Absolutely, yeah. But brought the great J.P. Bewley over, with me today. I figured I couldn't handle 2 guys by myself. It would be 2 against 1, actually 3 against 1. So I brought some backup here. J.P., how are you today?
I'm doing well, Alvin. Thank you.
Great.
Now, JP, you're with Big Cloud Analytics?
That's correct.
So what are you guys doing for folks?
What are we doing for folks? We're doing real-time predictions on marketing as well as employee engagement and sales. I've been in the data and analytics space pretty well all my career. I was sitting here trying to think about which sandboxes that I'd been in when Alvin laid that out, and I was quickly having sandbox envy because I feel like I've been in the same sandbox my entire career. I would describe myself as a serial entrepreneur, and I've been working in the marketing and marketing technology space my entire career. First company I started was in Arkansas, and after several years of doing that, exited that business and went to Silicon Valley.
So you were in analytics in Arkansas?
I was in analytics in Arkansas. Counting teeth.
Was there an analytic hub there? Like, what's the startup world like there?
It was this was early days of the internet, and so it was sort of like selling religion. It was very difficult. There wasn't a lot of people that were buying, but we found a few companies that were early adopters and kind of rode the internet marketing wave with them and had a lot of really good success. In those days, the internet in many ways was starting out with the corporate brochure and moving it to the web. But then it very quickly started to evolve into how do I get the people that are coming to this corporate brochure a little bit more engaged. Mm-hmm. And we'll talk about that theme of engagement and as it kind of translates into learning and starting a dialogue with consumers, I think probably through the course of the time today. But from Arkansas, went out to Silicon Valley, spent a decade out there, founded a company called Rain Media. Rain Media was a combination of a management consulting firm, a technology firm, and an analytics firm. And so it was one of the first companies to really start to blur the lines between what was the traditional agency space, what was more of the hardcore data crunching space, and the technology space. And we worked with a lot of B2B companies, folks like Microsoft. We worked with Sun Microsystems, was a company that we were doing a lot of work for at the time. You got to remember this was late 90s. This was before the bubble burst, and so some of the companies that I mentioned, you're like, wait a minute, who are they? Are they still
around? Right.
And then there's obviously some that are still up and thriving. We did a lot in the banking sector, Washington Mutual, and rode the bubble up and then saw the bubble burst and the chimpanzees cry at the Super Bowl. Went through that whole journey, and it was interesting because you had a lot of crazy business behavior. Speaking of learning insights, a lot of crazy business behavior leading up to 1999, 2000 timeframe. And then after the bubble burst, it was kind of pick up the pieces, figure out how to survive, because a lot of those budgets just very, very quickly dried up. And I'm happy to say that we figured out how to survive out of the bubble burst there, and did that through the mid 2000s before I exited that business. Went from there to Axiom, which was the largest.
This guy can't hold a job.
I know.
That's what we're learning here. That's the key learning.
I told you he was
right.
impressive.
That's right. Now you got to remember though, there's 10 years in that span there. But went from there to Axiom, which was the largest consumer database in the world, and to start a global strategy practice. And it was interesting because it was a entrepreneurial venture within a NASDAQ publicly traded billion-dollar company. But came in as employee number one to build out the global strategy practice, and spent 5 years at Axiom. I'll go ahead and get that out right there up front because we'll talk about another transition in a minute. But spent 5 years at Axiom. We built that up to about a 650-person operation in 14 countries, about $325 million in revenue. And at its terminal point there, as I was making my exit from Axiom, we had about 100 PhDs and statisticians that were looking at big data, looking at a lot of information about consumers, all in a privacy-assured, compliant way, and making predictions about what those consumers were likely to do. What are they likely to buy next? Are they going to be a high-value customer for my brand? Are they attracted to certain brands? So do they have a brand affinity? What's their in-market timing? When will they buy? Are they price sensitive? How much will they pay?
Now, all this analytics and data that you're culling and going through, and you're making predictions, are you able to? I know you're able to tell me what happened in the past that you're probably really good at.
Yep.
Like, how good are you at telling me what's going to happen in the future?
About 88% accurate.
88%.
Wow.
So you can tell an individual is a tire kicker or going to be a loyal customer and a zealot?
Yep, Absolutely. Now, what's really interesting about that is we all like to think of ourselves as individuals, right? So everybody sitting around the table here, you're profoundly unique. You're paving your own way.
There's some rumor that humans are very evolved and top of the food chain, and that we got a lot of stuff figured out.
That's true.
That's
However, I would suggest to you that in the U.S. population that we net out into about 80 different personas. So 80 unique personas from a consumer buying behavior within the U.S. population. I'd further suggest to you that in the UK that's about 76, and in France it's about 72. And so just by that pattern recognition alone, we're fairly predictive in the way that we're going to behave in our interactions with a particular brand.
And then what do you do with that knowledge now? How does a company benefit from knowing that there's 80 buckets that a typical person is going to fall into?
So to your point about becoming pretty good at looking backwards in the rearview mirror and understanding what happened, and that's really where it all begins, is because within your four walls today as an organization, there is transactional longitudinal data about what consumers have done. So what I mean by that simply is if you look at the history that's happening in those point-of-sale systems over a period of time, that's where you get kind of the longitudinal component.
And those are facts now. That's not theoretical.
Those are memorialized, right?
Right.
Those have happened. So you look back across that and you start to see patterns emerge. And the simplest analogy to think of it, although it's not an exact analogy, is you go into Amazon and you see customers who bought this also bought this.
Right.
That's associative analysis or collaborative filtering, and that's based off of all this backward-looking transaction data that has happened over the last some period of time. And the period of time is it really depends on the product category that you're talking about. But what you do is you take that longitudinal transaction data that's happened in the past and you personify that into a certain set of behavioral personas, and then you append some exogenous data from an outside source, like an Axiom or some other data provider, and you put a face on that consumer. Age, income, net worth, presence of kids in the household, has an Amex Gold card, has pets, likes to travel, those types of things. Those two data sets combined together allow you then to look forward. Because also in that rearview mirror data, you've got the rest of the journey. And so when you look at a whole journey of a consumer life cycle, someone who's come in and done business with your brand, they've bought multiple products and services, and then they've left you over a 24-month period, you've got a full view of a journey there, and you get enough patterns and you understand that journey. When you personify that consumer, you see that 35-year-olds with this age, income, and net worth have typically progressed through this journey in this way. And then at a moment in time, when you look at an individual in that consumer database and you say, hey, wait a minute, they're 35, they're this age, they're this income, they're this net worth, they're only 2/3 of the way through the journey. Wonder where they're going to go next. And so you can regress that into the future and use it to predict with some cone of certainty what they're likely to do next.
But how, like, when you know this data, like you use, that's an iPhone?
That's an iPhone.
Could I move you to my Note? If I'm Samsung, can I get you to switch?
You could get me to.
What do I have
I'm
to
not
do?
sure you could get me personally to switch,
no,
but as a consumer,
But your persona, number 62.
Number 62. Well, it's actually really interesting that you asked that question, because one of the companies that we did this for was a European smartphone manufacturer. And when we sat down with the global CMO the first time, I remember it very distinctly. Actually, it's coming up. The anniversary of this is coming up because it was the week of Thanksgiving.
Wow.
We're celebrating Thanksgiving in the U.S. They're obviously not celebrating that in England.
Right.
And so he was all the more happy to have us get on a plane and come see him that week. You know,
because for him it's Thursday.
Oh, exactly. And and he's getting back at the colonists as well, right? And so we hop on a plane, we go over, we meet with him, and he said, "You know what? Here, I've got this problem." He said, Apple's come up with this iPhone, and all the youth are buying my phone now, and they're all on social media. They're all on Facebook and Twitter and Habbo Hotel at the time, and what was MySpace? And so I don't understand this new trend of social media. I don't understand how to engage youth. So why don't you do a workshop or a pilot with me and help me understand youth and how they behave in social media? We had this little suspicion in the back of our minds that that really wasn't his problem. But he's the global CMO of a large smartphone manufacturer. We want to do business, and so you have to figure out a way to say that politely and say it analytically based, right?
Or have him to say it, right?
Or have him to say it even better, right? And put a couple patterns in front of him and have him say it would be even better. And so we went away and we did some initial number crunching, and what we found was they were shipping about 88 million devices a year. And they knew who less than 1% of the people walking around with those phones in their hand were, because they were disintermediated from the consumer by the operators, who knew was BT and Orange and AT&T and Verizon and those types of folks. So one of the first things that we had to do for them was what I refer to as a clawback strategy. And I've done this with a number of brands, but we need to figure out a way to engage those consumers to the point that we can get a relevant data set and begin to understand who they are, why they're walking around with that phone, and therefore to get to the heart of your question of, can I cause you to do something different? And something different.
Because isn't that what all your customers want?
To do something different?
They want the consumer to choose them.
They want to choose them.
And they want their
And
existing customer to stay with them.
To keep them was a really, really big thing in this instance, because the iPhone had just hit the market, a lot of new competition, so they were facing a lot of attrition. And they were looking at some Nielsen data which suggested to them that their intent to repurchase, when somebody walked back into a store, their loyalty score was below 20%. And so to keep them was a really, really big deal. And I mean, it was stop the hemorrhaging kind of change that this organization needed to go through. And so facing this less than 20% loyalty, we had to figure out a way to drive awareness and consideration much earlier in the process, because you've all went and shopped for a phone, right? Mm-hmm. You walk in and you think you're going to do something. However, when you go in to do something, there's somebody there in the store that tells you ought to do something really different. Right. And it's typically a 20-year-old kid that knows way more about the phone than you do, and they get you all excited and hot and bothered about the things that this new phone will do. And before you know it, you went in to buy brand X and you walked out with brand Y. So they not only were they facing a very low intent to repurchase, but they were facing a sales channel that would take them in a completely different direction.
They're saboteurs, the sales channel.
They're brand saboteurs in that sense. Yeah, the operators thought of them as concierge, so to speak, but the brands of the smartphone manufacturers thought very possibly these folks are saboteurs. So we did enough initial data analysis to be able to look, and what we found is that in that instance, we were right that it really wasn't the youth that were walking around with that phone. It was the 30-something professionals, and we gave enough data back and put it in front of him, to Alvin's point, where he looked at it and he said, "Oh, well, I guess I really don't understand who my consumers are, and all these new features, products, and services that I'm designing for what I thought was a youth segment in my product roadmap probably don't match up to who actually has my phone today." And so we found all sorts of interesting things in the data. Some of the things we found in the data, just very simply put, if that phone has 10 features on it and you're using 2, and we can educate you over a period of time to convince you to use 3 or 4 or 5 of those features, your likelihood of repurchase when you walk back in the store gets much, much stronger.
Because you're in too deep now.
You're in too deep.
The cost of changing is too painful.
Well, it's that, plus it's also when you educate a consumer over the course of a life cycle, what starts to happen is you're starting to extract more value out of that device. Mm-hmm. That device had that value all along, but if we didn't educate you on how to use those features, you didn't realize it.
It just remained latent.
It just remained latent. The other thing that Apple did really, really well in that space was they created an ecosystem. And it wasn't just the device. There was a whole surrounding set of products and services in addition to the device. For example, iTunes, the App Store, and the available content was tremendous. I mean, at that time there were, I think, something in the neighborhood of 20 million songs and 1.5 million apps on the App Store. I think now it's well over 100 million. And so you make an investment in content as well as an investment in the device. And so fundamentally that ecosystem was represented by hardware, content, and accessories, because they also had a proprietary 30-pin device or adapter that you had a plug-in in your car for. You had one in your house for. You had all these chargers. Before you know it, you've spent $1,000 in accessories surrounding that smartphone. You're all in.
Right.
It's impossible to change. And so educating consumers about the device usage on the phone. So we actually listened to the device usage in an anonymous way across those 88 million devices out there and saw what features people were using. And then we would classify them into segments. And if we saw that they were fitness-oriented, we would say, hey, did you know your phone under these two menu screens has a pedometer? Next time you go out for a run, turn that pedometer on. Well, guess what? We just increased your level of engagement with that device, and so your intent to repurchase that device goes up substantially. And you buy deeper and deeper into the ecosystem. You get a footpod that'll only talk to that phone, and before you know it, you're going to buy that no matter what that guy in the store says. Hey, you need to check out this new Note, and you're like, I've got all these things surrounding the iPhone. I've got all this content. There's no way you're going to get me to buy anything else but that. And so that repurchase decision happens long before you ever get to that point of transaction, and that's where lifecycle marketing became very, very important. And to know how to engage a consumer in that lifecycle marketing really was all about getting into the data and analytics.
So I'm simultaneously excited and a little bit freaked out at your capabilities, and I find myself in this conversation like reaching for my wallet while you're talking. So because I really
well, he
resonate.
knew you were going to do that.
Yeah, because I'm number 53. He knows exactly how to talk to number
already.
53. So how does the sales and marketing side of your business work, though? How do you get to have this kind of substantive conversation? It can't be easy to sit down and just get in the door with Joe CMO. Or
for a CMO, they know about you. You probably have a ton of thought leadership, or they're probably half sold before you even meet with them.
Well, you've got an interesting transition happening in marketing right now. Marketing is one of the last free spending parts of an organization. So you saw ERP come to supply chain, and people invested in SAP and Oracle and PeopleSoft to automate their supply chain and take waste out of that. The same kind of trends happening in marketing today. And I always kind of flash back to this famous quote from John Wanamaker from the late early 1900s, where he said, 50% of my advertising is wasted. I just don't know which half, right? And that's still true in marketing to some extent today. I mean,
is it 50% still?
Well, a successful campaign, the response rates to a successful campaign are somewhere between, on the low side, around 1%, to on the high side, 3%.
So the bar isn't that high for you.
The bar's not that high, So it's
you don't have to be that good.
I tend to like to operate that way, where it's really easy to step over. But in all seriousness, though, there's a transition that's happening in the marketing function within businesses today. It's transitioning from an art to a science. Mm-hmm. You still have certain CMOs that are coming at it from the above-the-line brand and art, and it's all about the creative and the campaign. But you have a new generation of CMOs that are really embracing data science and marketing science and really looking for those consumer patterns in data. And those are some very rich and very engaging conversations, for sure.
But they're taking your call, I guess, is my point.
Right now, big data and analytics is ablaze in the business world.
So, like back in the day, you were mentioning like the Super Bowl, what was the ROI on a sock puppet? Like now the ROI on pretty much everything.
Yeah, absolutely. Now it happens in many cases post hoc facto, right? Mm-hmm. So I won't name the brand, but there was a consumer packaged goods company.
What's it rhyme with?
But they make beverages, and they've had some. Pretty big Super Bowl splashes over the last several years. And so, I mean, those Super Bowl spots obviously are ridiculously expensive. And so set aside the sock puppets and the chimpanzees and some of the crazier stuff, this is more kind of tried and true brand that has a lot of experience buying big media and driving something like a Super Bowl audience. And they get all the creative and they make a really, really funny commercial that everybody's talking around the water cooler and things. Well, the way that you understand whether that works or not actually comes down to the products that flow through the convenience stores out there across the United States. And so over the next so many days, weeks, months, you can actually look at that product flow through each of those convenience stores and begin to understand.
But is that really true? I mean, what if there was a cold wave? Wouldn't that impact the consumption of something like that more? If all of a sudden it's 100 degrees for 5 days after that, wouldn't that drive more consumption than any ad?
That is a fantastic question. That is a very, very informed question. And absolutely things like macroeconomic factors, temperature, those types of things will absolutely factor in. And if you go back to kind of the old world of how that used to be done analytically, so this science has evolved a lot over the last 25 years, where those types of macroeconomic factors were much more relevant in the sense that you were looking at spend data for marketing, consumer purchase data, and you were trying to tease out a lag effect between those two data sets. I spend here, did purchases happen here? What was the distance between those data points? What's the relative height between those two peaks? Oh, wait, we had a heat wave for 5 days. It's 100 degrees. This peak's higher. Now we're not going to give that attribution to the marketing folks. They really don't deserve it. It was hot, right? Or there's a recession, right? So consumer price index is suppressed. And so I'm going to give them more credit than what the data is showing they deserve because consumers are actually still buying, but it's blunted because of the recession. So I'm going to give them more credit. So that was a much more top-down macroeconomic approach to marketing attribution. What we're seeing more and more with big data, and specifically streams coming from Facebook and Twitter, is that you can tease out more at an actual individual level what's going on from a buyer intention or a buyer follow-through. And if you go back and apply these personas over the top of it, you can build this up bottoms-up analysis. And so you see a lot of this analysis now that kind of comes from both directions, where you're doing a top-down analysis, you're doing a bottoms-up analysis at the consumers, and you're trying to make those two things tie in the middle. And one of the really interesting things that has emerged as a result of the cloud, so to speak, is this whole notion of community-based learning. And so James Suwecki wrote a book several years ago called The Wisdom of Crowds. You guys have seen crowdsourcing and probably talked about it here on the show and things where you're doing more community-based algorithms in learning. And that is one of the most interesting aspects of the way that analytics is evolving over the next 5 to 10 years is this whole notion of community-based or normative learning. Because I can have a pretty good indication going into a retail high-fashion customer what's going to work and what's not going to work because I have a normative data set of campaign successes and failures over the last 5 to 10 years across 200, 300 brands gives you a pretty good indication of what's going to work. So you start out with a normative data set that's a heuristic that says this gets you in the ballpark. It's 80% accurate, and then we'll take your first-party transaction data and we'll fine-tune that 15% more accurate, and then we'll bring in some third-party data and try to get that last little 5%. But that's a really, really informed question.
Now, I understand how this is working a little bit more in a marketing and a business branding situation. In terms of big data, can this help the education of a child? Can we take a child, the way they learn, and take data that based on test scores and the way that they've approached different types of learning that they've gone through, say, in middle school, high school, and can we teach them better by learning how they learn? On an individual basis, you know what I'm saying is take some of the same techniques that you're using for a brand or product, service, and then have it help a child be a better learner.
Yeah, so this question I think is near and dear to my heart for a couple of reasons. One is I have a 4-year-old and a 7-year-old. And the second is that it speaks to what we're doing with Cofactor, which is an employee engagement platform. And so kind of coming very specifically to your question, then I'm going to bridge it also over to the professional world. So, my 7-year-old second grader brings home just a waft of papers every day, right? All these math homework and worksheets and reading scores and I get his folder every day, and I'm going through all these different sheets, and I'm looking at the scores, and I'm just scanning them. I'm just seeing, okay, everything is 96 or 98 and above. Okay, it's good. I'm not digging into it too much. But buried in each of those papers is some insight there, right? There's a red check mark on problem number 3. And what I'm not seeing as I'm looking at those papers and I'm just scanning them on a day in and day out basis is a couple of things. One is I'm not seeing that longitudinal view, which is in math he's always 96 to 97. I know that kind of intuitively. In reading he's doing this and this and this, but what I'm not seeing in there is that lower level of detail, which would suggest that question number 3 that's got that red check mark here, and question number 15 on this next paper that has that red check mark, and question number 10 on this next paper that has that check mark, all actually have to do with addition or subtraction that include 3 digits, right? So there's a learning in there that I'm just missing. Similarly, in reading, where his comprehension scores are going off the charts or where his comprehension scores are maybe lagging a little bit, what I'm not seeing longitudinally there is that if it's a nonfiction book that he's 2 percentage points lower than he is on fiction books. So he's not as engaged because it's drier material or whatever the case may be. That's a key learning for me as a parent, to be able to sit down with him. And if we're doing a bedtime story, what should we be doing? More nonfiction, right?
Right.
And so I think to get to that level of learning and engagement using analytics and big data science for something like a second grader, what has to happen is, we live in a pretty rural area here in Georgia, and I think we have 2 or 3 iPads in the classroom, which is fantastic to have 2 or 3 iPads in a classroom in rural Georgia in a school. But imagine if there were 20 kids in that classroom and there were 20 iPads in that classroom, and every one of those worksheets was an iPad app. We would have that long-term longitudinal data. Yeah. And so I think that there's 2 evolution points that happen there. One is recognizing that there are patterns in that long-term longitudinal data that will help the way that child learns on an individualized basis. The second is that you have to have the access points, right? You have to have some way to capture that data so that you can develop that data set and be able to make those types of predictions.
But wouldn't the third point be the funding that's necessary to be able to drive that type of research, right?
Yeah, so either the kids are going to have to bring their own iPads or the schools are going to have to provide them, right? Absolutely. The cofactor business that Alvin and I are working on, this is very near and dear to our hearts when it comes to employee learning and engagement. So we've all seen the annual employee satisfaction survey, right? You've all participated in one of those and tried to remain anonymous while you tank certain scores along the way. The reality is that is a very episodic communication with an employee base. It's happening once a year. We've actually even talked to a couple of organizations where it's happening every other year. Imagine
that's too much. Once a year.
Yeah. Well, keep in mind, these are organizations that have 50, 80, 100,000 employees. It's a large ordeal and a big investment to get that survey on an annual basis, and in some instances, semi-annual, right? And so you're looking at an episodic snapshot of what your employee base is actually focused on or the problems they're having. And that same problem that we just talked about with the second grader exists with every organization and their engagement with employees if they've got more than 1,000 employees or so, where they can't just go walk the floors and have that conversation from a C-suite, senior management perspective. And so you've got these organizations that have 50, 100,000 employees. The lifeblood of their business is their employees, and their employee engagement has real-world, quantifiable bottom-line results. And whether you're going to drive business outcomes or not, and innovation that could come up from those employees, how do you get innovation from 100,000 people when you only talk to them once a year in a structured format? And so that same analogy of if I could look into that second grader's paper at question number 10, or if I could look into that second grader's paper at question number 15 and figure out that it's addition and subtraction with 3 digits, if I could reach into a conversation between that frontline manager and an employee and understand that part of our employee dissatisfaction happens to do with machine number 23 that has a pretty serious maintenance issue, and that's creating me a bottom line impact of $5 to $6 million a year, and a periodic maintenance plan on that device is $100,000 a year. There's some key business outcomes to be learned there. Not to mention the fact that it's going to cost me more to replace that employee than their annual salary by about 1.5 to 2x.
No doubt, no doubt. What's interesting about this whole employee engagement conversation is that several things started to converge that kind of got my attention.
Well, I was interested to learn more about how you found this guy and exactly how you're exploiting him.
Yeah.
So let's get your perspective on it.
Well, let's go with the second question first. We prefer to use the term leverage versus exploiting.
Language is important.
That is very
right.
important, And to answer your first question, my mother always said, son, and certainly she's not the only one that said this. She said, your ability to grow in life will be directly affected by two things. Number one, the books you read, and number two, the people you hang out with. So you can see the people I walk in the door with, like JP, they have escalated my whole lot in life. So I'm very happy to be able to introduce JP to y'all today. But what was interesting is that many years ago, in 2006, when I went back to KSU's Executive MBA program for the international component, because I went through the Bell South Executive MBA program, we took a trip over to Romania. And while there, I was introduced to a gentleman named Vlad Grigori. And Vlad was the co-owner of an ad agency called Tempo, one of the most successful ad agencies in Romania. And interestingly enough, we forged a friendship, and then they came here, and we hosted them and took them over to the aquarium and had a good time. And after that kind of conversation, several years ago, or several years hence, I actually spent some time in Romania bringing our students again to the international component as the director of the program. Mm-hmm. He and I got together, and he was telling me about this employee engagement tool he was beginning to work on. Interestingly enough, very early stage, just getting it started. And I have obviously large interest in employee engagement because, when you're running this type of an organization and you've spent time organizationally with a company like Bell South, AT&T, customers are important internal, and customers are important external. And so Flash kind of moved forward to a couple of years ago where Vlad then said, hey, look, I've got something I want you to take a look at. We spent some time at his home in Romania and looked at it. And I thought, well, this is interesting. Of course, it's not quite ferreted out yet. It's not vetted enough. And then you flash forward again to several months ago, and he says, hey, I've got something you really want to take a look at. So we sat down, we chatted about it. And the interesting component about this whole employee engagement tool that he has designed and we're working with him on, and me more in a consultative type role, especially in a role where we were talking about how do you apply this, who really can see the benefits of this. It was interesting when I got the call from you about coming on Learning Insights. You normally think of a paradigm where we're trying to help other people learn about things. But in this paradigm, it's interesting that the cofactor is really flipping that paradigm and learning from employees. So they've got something to say. Interestingly enough, corporations, companies, entities are only hearing it once a year. And interestingly enough, engagement becomes something a little bit more deep than we would think. You would think that a company engaging employees is employee engagement. And that's really not it. It's really when employees are willing to do more for the company, they're engaged. That's employee engagement. Did I capture that correctly, JP?
Absolutely. In employees or customers. So we talked about that smartphone manufacturer example. Part of the key learnings that influenced their product roadmap came from harnessing the knowledge and value of the consumer base that were walking around with their phones. The similar kind of concept applies to an employee workforce. And, businesses trade in a lot of assets, but fundamentally they have two major assets, their customers and their employees. And the more barriers they can remove between the two of those different audiences and the better engaged they can get them, the better business returns that they're going to drive. And analytically, there's a lot of interesting things that you can do to greater increase your engagement with that employee base, greater increase the engagement with the consumer base. And harnessing that knowledge value is an area that our chief scientist, Dr. V. Kumar, spent a lot of time on, is understanding customer knowledge value and understanding employee engagement and being able to predict those things on an analytic basis and then use that so that you can quantify it in monetary terms. Because at the end of the day, you've still got to have a business initiative around this that says, hey, I want to listen to consumers, I want to get them involved in my new product roadmap, and I want to go spend $20 million in doing that. Well, guess what? You got to know that there's more than $20 million in return before you can convince the board to make that type of investment. analytics is one of the paths that gets you there. But that platform and being able to harness the innovation of that employee base is tremendously powerful, and is going to drive some really interesting returns for business overall.
Yeah, because as you pointed out earlier, there's a lot that we're leaving on the table as corporations, as entities, as organizations, and that is, the innovation that comes from employees actually getting engaged and actually wanting to really, contribute to the overall success of the organization.
Right.
So we got to get a client in here. I want to hear this from the client's perspective. Don't you think that'd make a fantastic?
Do you have a
segment?
local client?
You got an Atlanta client that might be up for that sometime?
Yeah, we could probably work something out.
I mean, and maybe a school for a different. I think it would be fascinating. I am absolutely blown away. I'm a little freaked out. Okay, I'm not gonna lie about it.
But is it because there's so much more computer power now that you're able to kind of drill down this deep and really? Because now you're just looking at breadcrumbs, right? And then before you needed, like you said, episodic or big events people were making decisions based on.
Yeah.
And now you're really just culling lots and lots of teeny bits of data and then making judgments based on those kind of clues rather than something dramatic.
Yeah, well, our chief scientist says that we're absolutely at a perfect storm, and that's constituted by a few different things happening. One is that storage capacity, the price of storage capacity is just, the bottom has fallen out of it, right? And so it's really cheap to keep all of this data that organizations have been generating for a long time. Now every 2 days as a human population, we generate more data, more recorded data than all of mankind through the dawn of recorded history up to 2012. So there's just more data in general. If you're talking about Twitter streams, Facebook streams, all these interaction points, there's more data to work with, and more sophisticated computational power, CPUs, allow you to deal with this and be able to tease out these patterns. But the other part that I think not to be lost in this, because those are the easy ones to point to, right? Storage is cheaper, there's more computing power, and there's more data being generated. But the one that I think not to be lost, and this is where some of the art still applies to this, is that the evolution of how you think about these things has also continued to move forward. And so, I'll give you an example. People replace their automobile on average every 5 to 7 years. How in the world can you make and by the way, when they get ready to go shop for a new car, they go through awareness, consideration, and purchase in a 6-week time frame. So you've got a purchase that happens every 5 to 7 years. One of the largest expenditures that a consumer is going to do, outside of a house in their lifetime, and they do it multiple times in their lifetime. They're only going to do that every 5 to 7 years, and you've got 6 weeks from the time that they decide that they're going to go shop till they're actually going to complete the transaction somewhere. How in the world, analytically, do you get in front of that? Well, the reality is if you only do that off of auto purchase data, it's too chunky, right? It's too much of a big block data set. There's not enough granularity there to make a prediction. So one of the other things that's happened here is being able to understand that multiple data sets matter, and data sets with greater degrees of granularity matter, and that you have to think about this as a holistic ecosystem surrounding this consumer about which data is going to be predictive for me in determining that outcome and how do I get in front of it. And so sales and service data, the actual coming in and changing the oil and keeping up with the mileage, that's really important. And so that data is liquid gold. It was kind of this analogy that came out a couple of years ago that data is the new oil. Right, and so the businesses are thinking about data now as an asset, and it's the new oil. Well, if it's the new oil, then where are the new refineries? The new refineries are in the process of analytics, and so that service data coming back of the mileage on your car is a pretty good indicator that you might be thinking about replacing it. DMV data coming back about the garage mate. So if it's an SUV and there's a Honda Civic sitting in the garage beside it, it tells you some things about what that next likely repurchase would be.
Wow.
And then you've got these other data streams from Twitter and Facebook where you do a mention about, hey, I think we're going to take the family and go car shopping this weekend. Boom, trigger event. Get on it, start predicting. And so thinking about it, the thinking of how to apply these data sets has evolved quite a bit as well. And saw a really interesting example for an insurance company where they're spending millions and millions of dollars in acquisition marketing to drive new customers to the brand. And the short version of this story is that we ended up with two populations that looked absolutely homogeneous. And so, population A was 52 years old, this age, income, net worth, kids were out of the nest. This population was 52 years old, same age, same income, kids were out of the nest. They both had Amex Gold cards. They both liked to travel. We had a big problem. Population A was following through and buying the product. Population B was stopping after they called and requested additional information. And they were about equal-sized populations, and they looked identical. However, we knew that if we could figure out why population B wasn't completing the sale, that we could potentially reduce the cost of acquisition of new customers by half if we could get them to take some sort of action. So the net of all that is we looked at about 200 quantitative elements. We kept peeling the onion back, and we went down all these dimensions, and we couldn't find any difference between these populations. So we hit pause on the quantitative journey. We got a couple in a room, and we started talking to them, and we went back to qualitative, right? So we brought kind of a focus group type of mindset back in. So they both like to travel. Well, tell us about travel. So population A was, we get 2 or 3 friends together, 2 or 3 couples together. We go on a cruise, or we go to Europe once or twice a year. Population B, tell us about travel. Oh, we throw the grandkids in an RV with the dogs, and we go to a national park. And something was different there, right? And so what we figured out, we went back to the quant, and we went deeper in the data elements. And what we ultimately found was presence of pets was the determining factor between population A and population B. And so if we just didn't market to people that didn't have pets, or if we only marketed to people that didn't have pets, then our metrics on the marketing were going to be a lot better. We're going to save this company millions of dollars on an annual basis. So why, right? It ends up, it's a dental insurance product. So why would you think that a dental insurance product not having pets would make you convert at a higher rate than having pets? It's because you're kissing your dog, or what's going on there. The reality is that the dental insurance was dental hygiene and dental appearance was seen as a cosmetic factor as opposed to a health factor. And the population that was traveling with other couples and traveling to the Caribbean or traveling internationally tended to score higher on appearance than the population that were hopping in an RV with the grandkids and dogs and going to a national park. And that was the triggering factor of why dental insurance mattered. And so there's some very counterintuitive stuff in the data, but you have to think about those data sets in a different way. And so I think the thinking has evolved in addition to the technology as well.
So I'm reluctant to tell everyone what we're going to do next because JP already knows, but just for the benefit of
only with an 88% accuracy.
That's right.
For the regular folks. First of all, Alvin, we're going to promote you to Chief Booker. Fantastic job. Thanks so much for bringing JP in. And before we wrap, we're going to make sure that we get contact information for both of you so our listeners can reach out and learn more about these topics. So let's do that. What's the best way for folks to reach out and learn more?
You certainly can reach out to me at acmiles@bellsouth.net and still maintain my email address over at Kennesaw State, acm0996@kennesaw.edu. And my Twitter handle is Miles_Alvin C. Correct, Kevin?
That is correct.
And knowthefuture.com? How do we get you?
It's magic8ball.com.
Magic8ball.com.
Tell me the answer. Tell me the answer. So I'll give you first a couple of websites to take a look at. The first is bigcloudanalytics.com. And there's a thought leadership section on that website where you can watch a lot of videos about the application of this science and predictions. The second that I'll give you is cofactor, co-factor.com, and that will give you more information about employee engagement and the software platform associated with that. My email address is JP as in Patrick, Bewley, BEWLEY, at bigcloudanalytics.com, JP BEWLEY at bigcloudanalytics.com. And if you can't figure that out, info at bigcloudanalytics.com. We'll get you almost to the same spot. Somebody will come flag me. And Twitter handle is at JPBMobile.
Well, it has been an absolute delight having you back, both back in the studio, and I'm quite sincere, and I think, Lee, it sounds like it's a good idea. If you're up for it, I think it'd be a fantastic segment to have a client come in and,
Right, to get
and
a kind of
their
a 360
perspective.
view of what their expectations are and what reality was.
Yep.
So
absolutely.
we're delighted to do that if you feel like that, search, and or maybe a school at some point. But regardless, in some fashion, we're going to pick this conversation up again. This has been just fantastic. Thank you both.
Yeah. No, thank you for having us.
And thank you, yeah, because we would look forward to having an opportunity to talk to, what business leaders, the questions, what are they asking? What should they be asking about employee engagement? Because there's a lot of stuff that's left on the table.
Right.
that
There
we can
you
help.
go. All right. Well, until next time, this is Stone Payton for Lee Cantor, our producer, Kevin Finn, our guests this morning, Alvin Miles and J. Patrick Bewley, and everyone here at the Business Radio X family, saying we'll see you next week on Learning Insights.